Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something absolutely crucial, the timeless mechanics of power projection. We're going to literally connect the dots between ancient Persian conquests and today's modern geopolitical chessboard. We're looking at how empires actually stretch their reach across the globe. And honestly, the logistical headaches of doing so haven't changed all that much in 2.5 millennia. Think about it. You literally cannot fight a war thousands of miles from home without two things: a rock-solid logistical infrastructure to move your people in gear, and the absolute cooperation of your allies. It's a profound realization that directly links the war chariots of Cyrus the Great right up to the aerial refueling tankers of 2026. Here is our roadmap for The Explainer. We'll cover the rise of the Persian military, their tactics, cavalry, and armor, followed by the evolution of imperial defense. Then, we'll fast forward to modern strategic flexibility, and finally, look at the host nation dilemma. Section 1. Rise of Persian military, forging an ancient superpower. We're talking about roughly 1,000 years of absolute military dominance here, starting with the Achaemenid Empire organizing around 550 BCE, rolling right through the Parthian cavalry's dominance, all the way to the hyper-centralized Sasanian Empire in 224 CE. Now, how exactly did they pull this off? Well, rather than just relying on a standing army, early Persian kings mastered power projection through something called the Kara. This was a massive levy system. They'd call upon their distant regional satrapies, basically their provinces, to supply huge numbers of troops. Since only the wealthy could afford their own gear, this system essentially conscripted the wealth, the manpower, and the local expertise from every single corner of their subjugated territories. And the diversity of these units was just incredible. You had the legendary 10,000 immortals acting as the elite infantry guard. They fought right alongside horse-borne and camel-borne cavalry, which, fun fact, the unique scent of the camels famously terrified enemy horses. Add in the shield-bearing frontline infantry plus regional archers and slingers, and you've got a massive combined arms machine built entirely on the backs of regional allies. Section 2. Tactics, Cavalry, and Armor. Mastering the battlefield. Okay, picture this. A typical early Persian battle required a wide open field to execute a highly coordinated three-step sequence. Step 1, the shield bearers form a totally static protective wicker wall. Step 2, from behind that wall, archers unleash an absolutely massive, continuous volley of arrows. We're talking up to 100,000 arrows a minute. Then, step 3, as the enemy freezes up or scatters, the fast-moving cavalry sweeps in with hit-and-run flanking maneuvers. It was designed to completely paralyze the enemy. But warfare evolves, right? The Parthians later took this system and leveled it up to counter Roman tactics. They introduced the cataphracts. These were heavily armored cavalry units where both the riders and the horses were encased entirely in steel helmets and full chainmail. They were basically impenetrable fortresses on horseback. And they combined that heavy armor with the legendary Parthian shot. This was a brilliant, deceptive tactic. The light cavalry would fake a retreat, drawing the enemy out at full gallop. Then, suddenly, without even having stirrups, mind you, they'd turn backward in their saddles and unleash a devastating shower of arrows. It completely ripped opposing formations apart, perfectly setting the stage for those heavy cataphracts to charge right into the broken lines. Section 3. Evolution of imperial defense, adapting the chain of command. To project this kind of power over centuries, their whole defense system had to adapt. The Parthians used a decentralized feudal system, great for quick local levies in a crisis, but honestly a bit too loose. The Sasanians later shifted to a highly centralized standing army. They brought back the old Achaemenid decimal system of tens, hundreds, and thousands, and even adopted Roman siege tech to build a hyper-organized military machine under the direct command of the king. So, what does all this mean for us today? Well, how do modern empires project power into this exact same region right now? Thousands of years later, today's global powers have to navigate the exact same logistical hurdles. You still need local bases, regional cooperation, and secure logistics to fight effectively in the Middle East. Section 4. Modern strategic flexibility, the new satrapies. Enter strategic flexibility. This is the contemporary military doctrine that prioritizes rapidly surging assets globally to wherever a crisis pops up. It's a total game changer, but here's the catch. It occasionally means overriding the specific defense commitments or even the actual reluctance of the local host nations. It completely rewrites the rules. We saw this play out perfectly during Operation Epic Fury in 2026. There was this huge, stark gap between public diplomacy and operational reality. Publicly, Gulf states like Saudi Arabia explicitly assured Iran they absolutely would not allow their territory to be used for attacks, mostly to protect vital infrastructure like desalination plants. But operationally, the U.S. bypassed that neutrality entirely by launching so-called defensive AWACS and KC-135 refueling tankers right from their soil. Just look at the vital enablers hosted in these technically neutral states. You've got AWACS and tankers at Prince Sultan Air Base, layered Patriot and THAAD defenses at Muwafaq Sulti, defensive coordination out of Ali Al Salem, and a massive regional hub at Al Udeid in Qatar. By labeling these assets as merely supportive, the U.S. effectively turned these sites into the operational center of gravity. The host nation's public refusal just didn't hold up against the reality of these logistical enablers. Section 5. The Host Nation Dilemma. Sovereign Control versus Alliance. This brings us to a really tricky spot for allies, the entrapment risk. Take South Korea, for example. Despite a 2006 agreement meant to protect them from regional entanglements, U.S. Patriot batteries and personnel were recently redeployed from the Korean Peninsula straight to the Middle East over Seoul's explicit objections. So it turns out a host nation's official refusal might no longer be enough to stop the gears of war when strategic needs take over. To survive this new era, experts say host nations like South Korea need to proactively set some hard boundaries. They're proposing a specific logistical support model that maps operational thresholds directly to political approvals, for instance, automatic approval for non-combatant evacuation. But you'd need strict prior consultation for aerial refueling and defensive ops, and an opt-out provision for intelligence tied to offensive data feeds. It's all about defining the rules before a sudden crisis makes the decision for you. And look, Sal actually has immense leverage to secure these terms. We're talking about a massive $150 billion shipbuilding investment that the American defense industrial base desperately needs. The U.S. relies heavily on power projection platforms like Camp Humphreys, and this financial weight gives South Korea a very real, very powerful seat at the table to dictate exactly how and when their territory is used. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought. As the mechanics of ancient empires echo into the 21st century, who will truly control the boundaries of the next great war? Will host nations effectively dictate their own terms and manage their alliances? Or will the sheer gravitational pull of superpower logistics drag them blindly onto the battlefield regardless of their consent? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics of power.